Okay, everybody, welcome to another episode of the Nostalgia Trap podcast. I am your host, David Parsons. I am happy to bring another episode to you today, and I'm happy to welcome the people who are listening to the show because they found it through the Baffler, which is pretty awesome. I mean, if you told me in the 90s that I would someday have a podcast that would be featured on the webpage of the Baffler, I would probably say, what's a web page and what's the Baffler? But both of those things are really exciting developments in my life personally. But also, I hope that the people that read the Baffler enjoy the Nostalgia Trap. I think that the kind of folk that enjoy the Baffler's kind of particular wit and particularly dark take on American politics and history will enjoy the similar kind of take we do here on the Nostalgia Trap. So check out the back catalog. We've got like over 100 episodes for free at thenostalgiatrap.com. And if you like what you hear, you can support the show. And I want to thank all the people who are supporting the show by going to patreon.com/nostalgiatrap. And if you pitch in seriously, buy me a cup of coffee a month. I think a cup of coffee is like $5, right? So for $5 a month, you can buy me a cup of coffee, which will also support the show, keep it going, and also I will give you bonus episodes and other stuff. So it's a deal, and a deal that I think is worth making if you want to keep the Nostalgia Trap going, which is something I certainly want to do. So if that's in your interest too, check out those bonus episodes. We've got a lot of cool stuff, including a lot of crazy conversations with Justin Rogers Cooper, an old Nostalgia Trap standby, an old Nostalgia Trap favorite. I've been having a lot of kooky conversations with Justin lately, and we're posting them as bonus episodes. So I know people love them. So check those out if you want to. And thanks so much for supporting the show. Okay, let's get to today's guest. Today's guest is Heather Cox Richardson. She is an American historian whose name you should know. She has a ton of really, really great books. Most of them are about the 19th century, about the Civil War, American politics. I was kind of interested in her work the most because I wanted to talk to her about the Republican Party. She's got a book out recently called To Make Men Free, A History of the Republican Party, which basically tracks the kind of ideological shifts since the Civil War. And I think that a lot of people are confused about that. They wonder, how is the Republican Party, this party that is just this kind of basically morphing into this nightmarish Nazi party right in front of us, where did that come from? And how is that connected to the Republican Party of Abraham Lincoln and anti-slavery and all the things that we thought were good about the Republican Party? So, Nixon's Southern strategy is part of that whole evolution. But Heather Cox Richardson has a much longer story to tell us. So I had a really great time talking to her. And of course, we did the usual Nostalgia Trap thing where she told me about where she grew up and how she was surrounded by people who told stories in Maine in her childhood. And that storytelling culture kind of led her to her interest in history and how that intersected with the larger kind of politics of the era. So this is a really great conversation. I hope you enjoy it. And again, thanks for everyone who's listening via the Baffler or iTunes or Stitcher or wherever you're finding this stuff. I love it, and it's helping us grow the show, and that's all I want to do is keep this thing on the air. As Peter, my producer, and I both work full time throughout the summer. We're super busy. We're trying to find time to do interviews, edit shows, put them up, and run the whole thing. So throwing us a few dollars makes us feel good and helps us feel like the whole thing is worth it, and people are appreciating our work. So if that's true, go to patreon.com/nostalgiatrap and subscribe to the show. It really helps us out. So thank you very much for all the people who are doing that already. And I hope you enjoyed this conversation. This is a good one. This is connecting the Civil War era politics to the Trump era politics. And this one, I think, is a really intense conversation. So I hope you enjoy it. This is me talking to historian Heather Cox Richardson. I started this show in 2013, so we were talking a lot about Obama, obviously, and the kind of landscape of politics that's changed, I guess, in a lot of ways since Trump, and we're kind of trying to frame that in the long view, if that makes sense. And instead of being reactive to the everyday outrage of Trump, I see the goal of this show in a lot of ways kind of taking a step back and thinking about the larger historical trends that led us to this moment. So those are the kinds of things that I think people listening to the show are looking for. Either, these personal stories about people's paths through academia and through the university system and writing their books and research and all that kind of stuff, but also kind of with an eye towards framing that history and giving people some bit of context for the larger things that are happening in America. So I know that sounds maybe a little ambitious, but that's what we're trying to do. When you think of the decade that you're coming of age and kind of getting to know being alive and getting to know being particularly an American, you're from Maine originally, is that right?
That's correct, yes. I grew up here. I was actually born in Illinois, but I grew up here.
Okay.
Where you're speaking to me now, actually.
Oh, nice. And when you're a young person, I often want to know, what is it that leads people to become academics? What is it that leads people to become historians? You come from a family that has professors in it. Is there that tradition in your family, or what led you down that path?
Well, there's professors in my family now. 3 of the 4 of us are in one way or another in academia, but in fact, no, not at all. I came from a small town in Maine, and the reason I ended up going the direction I did, I think, was because this is a town of storytellers. We made sense of our world by listening to the stories people told, and very early on, it was clear that people told the same story in very different ways. And they perceived what was going on in very different ways. So we had real questions. For example, we're right close to an island, and during the Civil War, that island declared itself independent of the Union and independent of the state of Maine. And to hear one person tell it, it's because they were Confederates and they liked slavery. To hear somebody else tell it, it's because they didn't like Union taxes. To hear somebody else tell it, it's because they were independent. And we learned to evaluate the sources that we were hearing these stories from, and for me to recognize that there's this incredibly rich tapestry of what we believe is important. And that doesn't always comport with what is really important. It doesn't really necessarily reflect what is happening, which I think is how I got into the idea of studying the relationship between the way people think about events versus what really happened. And my mother was a writer herself and very into history. So she and I would do the cemeteries, and she would tell me stories. And I'm from a town where my ancestors came before the Pilgrims as fishermen. So there was history every way we turned, and you can't move in a small town where your family has been forever without pulling threads that are attached to you that you may not even know. So, for example, somebody would look at me when I was growing up and say, "Oh, she's just like her grandmother." Well, I never knew my grandmother, but I was clearly being judged through a history that I didn't even have any access to. And so I think all those things together made me really want to understand more about the way people interacted with their world when I got into first prep school and then college and then graduate school. I actually started in college studying folklore, not studying history. I took a ton of courses in the folk and myth department. So I think that's if my upbringing matters, it's having this extraordinary wealth of storytellers with whom I grew up. And mind you, I am not one of them. My brother is a far better storyteller than I am. I could make you a list of 7 or 8 people in this town who are. I was a listener. They were the storytellers.
And where are you consuming these stories? Give me a picture of this storytelling culture. You say there's like 7 or 8 great storytellers in the town. Where do you hear their stories?
Well, when we would get together, we didn't really have TV, and we didn't really have access to telephones or anything. This is the 1960s in Maine, 1970s, and we had gathering places, people's houses, the docks. There was really nothing else to do. We're not close to movie theaters or anything. So if you were going to be entertained, it was by hanging out with people, and from that sort of community experience, some of our friends, and certainly the older generation, especially the men, were people that you would actively work to be with because they were just fascinating. God, they'd have you on the floor laughing. It was a really phenomenal sort of oral history and oral storytelling culture.
And how did that culture of storytelling and your development as kind of thinking about the gap or the space between images and reality, How did that intersect with politics and the stuff that was going on around you? You said this is happening in the late 60s and 70s. Are you aware of of politics? At what point is that kind of becoming something that's part of how you're thinking?
Well, my family always talked about politics. My dad was a Republican and my mother was a Democrat. And so it was always around. But I only really started paying attention to it with Watergate, which you simply couldn't miss in my family. And, I was born in 1962. I was the youngest of my siblings by far. And my siblings were on a different side than my dad was in all this. And, you couldn't miss it. And I couldn't understand. I remember when I was 10 in 1972, and I turned in the fall of 1972, I turned 10. And I remember my dad being so angry at Nixon and at Agnew and not being able to comprehend why he was so mad. And my brother trying to explain to me that he felt that the president had let him down. So that was the first time I really paid attention to politics, but it really, it didn't make me political, although I've always been fascinated by power, by who gets power and how one accumulates power, and that sort of community relationships and how somebody gets power over other people. And I was a waitress in Oklahoma in 1986 or so. And that's when I really became, no, I've got those dates. Yeah, I think it's 86 or so. And that's when I really became political, because I had been certain in 1980 that Ronald Reagan would not be elected, because who could elect him? He wasn't comporting with reality. And I remember sitting the night he was elected and thinking, oh my God, what have we done that we've elected this man? And then I went back to being a history student and, working on history and not really paying attention to the world around me. I was in college. And then I was a waitress after college in Oklahoma, and everybody I worked with was an evangelical Christian. And they were all staunch Reagan supporters. And they hated people like me that they call liberals, although they didn't hate me. They were very nice to me. But I was fascinated because their impression was that Reagan was helping them. And I was aware from the fact I was actually reading the news that he was destroying their world.
Right.
And yet they were staunch supporters. And I went back to graduate school. I had taken a year off of graduate school to move to Oklahoma. And I went back to graduate school thinking, I got to figure this out. I got to figure out why people are willing to believe something that is not true and are willing to put their lives on the line for it. And that's really where my work has been ever since. My first book was quite deliberately an attempt to look at what happens when you construct a world around a certain ideology and how that happens.
And this is the greatest nation on earth, right? That comes out of your dissertation.
Right.
And
it pretty much was my dissertation, actually.
And I wanted to ask you about that first of all, because I love how you're describing this kind of world where you're seeing this. I guess it's kind of like the Thomas Frank stuff of what's the matter with Kansas, kind of the idea of why are people voting against their interests here? Why are they voting for a candidate and a figure that's going to destroy them? So how does that lead you to the 19th century? How does that lead you to studying the Civil War?
Well, my undergraduate thesis, which I had also written with David Donald, was about the Civil War. And I believed that I would end up as a Civil War historian. And I had gotten into that with Eric Foner's Free Soil, Free Labor, Free Men, where I was fascinated by the way that people thought about politics. So I wrote an undergraduate thesis on how people thought about the coming of the Civil War. And so I went to work with Professor Donald in graduate school, and what I really wanted to know then was how the same men who had literally given their sons for the cause of the Union, the U.S. government during the Civil War, how they had turned around within a matter of years and become apologists for the robber barons.
Right.
So it was really intended to be a book about the robber barons in a way. And yet the more I studied that, the more I realized that you could not understand that unless you understood the economic system that they had put in place during the Civil War. So I ended up, it was almost, if you will, in a weird way, now that I'm looking back at it, a prequel to the work that I was later going to do. You couldn't understand anything in the late 19th century until you understood what had happened economically during the Civil War. So I think that's really what I was doing, although at the time I was violently allergic to Reconstruction. I thought, I can never make sense of this. It doesn't make any sense to me at all. I don't even know who the players are. I can't do it. But in retrospect, it was a very short leap from that first book to the later ones.
Why is that? How did you feel? How did you feel so kind of behind on the Reconstruction stuff, and how did you catch up so quickly?
Well, I felt like Reconstruction had always been taught to me topically, and it never made any sense to me. You come out of the Civil War, and all of a sudden, all anybody is talking about is African Americans in the South.
Right.
And all the poor white people seem to have gone away. And then all of a sudden, they simply disappear about, 1875, when all of a sudden there's all these railroad guys running around accumulating money, and all of a sudden African Americans fall off the face of the earth and they never exist again. And then you're talking about robber barons who have come from absolutely nowhere. And then maybe by the 1890s, you've got some women running around organizing for the first time, because I guess they didn't exist before that.
Right.
And you never heard about the American West. And I had grown up on Laura Ingalls Wilder, and I couldn't imagine that Laura Ingalls Wilder had lived through an era. She was born in 1867, right before the passage of the Military Reconstruction Act in March of that year. And I couldn't imagine a world in which, she was born and her dad said, okay, we're only going to think about African Americans for the next 7 years, but then we're going to forget about them and only think about Andrew Carnegie. And by the way, we're going to talk about Ma in about 20 years. And they were all living in the West. Yeah. So I was like, screw this. I'm going to let other people worry about this stuff. It's too much for me to handle. But the reality was when I finished I guess I had, it wasn't even when I finished the first book, because that sat forever as a manuscript with a publisher. And while that was going on, I don't even remember now why I did it. But I sat down and I read the New York Times from 1865 to about 1910, which sounds impressive, but the reality is it's only a 4-page paper, and there's only 2 pages of actual content. So it didn't take very long. And what shocked me was, I think I was probably casting around for a new book topic, but what shocked me was that what I read in that newspaper did not comport at all with what I had always been taught. And what I really remember doing was looking desperately, and this is, of course, before we had ProQuest and before we had the internet, looking desperately for Plessy v. Ferguson.
Right. And
repeatedly not being able to find Plessy v. Ferguson, the 1896 case that declares separate but equal acceptable. And thinking, I must be the world's worst researcher because it's not here. And I finally found one, it's mentioned in one line in the New York Times in the middle of the Supreme Court news. And it says, this case decided in favor of, and that's it. And the first thing I did when we got ProQuest at my university was to look for Plessy v. Ferguson, and that is the only place it showed up.
Wow!
And yet, in comparison, the civil rights cases, the overturning of the civil rights cases in 1883 was everywhere. It was front page news for months and months and months in every newspaper. And I'm like, something's going on here that I need to understand. And so, getting up to speed in Reconstruction, I never really got up to speed in Reconstruction in the old way that I didn't understand. I read all the books I was supposed to, but I couldn't make sense of them.
Right.
I got up to speed fast just by starting with the New York Times and saying, what do I see? If I were Laura Ingalls Wilder, what would I see when I read this newspaper? And that's where Reconstruction came from.
That's such a great narrative, because it's discovering the real history in a lot of ways there. When I think of Plessy versus Ferguson, I mean that in school, whether you're in high school or college, history courses, really front load the importance of Plessy versus Ferguson. You'd get the idea that it was just on the front page of every newspaper, such a transformative event. But it sounds like 1883 was more important. And 1883 is something that I don't think a lot of people know about. What happened in 1883 with those civil rights cases?
Well, actually, the reason people know 1883 without knowing that they know 1883 is that's really what rocketed Ida B. Wells to prominence, because she is one of the first people to challenge. She is the first person in Tennessee to challenge the Supreme Court decision. It's actually a series of decisions, But what happens is the Congress passes the Civil Rights Act of 1865 after Charles Sumner dies in 1974, and it provides for African Americans to have equal rights in public accommodations and in civic society. in a way that they had not before, with the argument that you couldn't truly enter sort of the free labor economy unless you had access to railroads and to hotels and to be able to go on the road and sell your business and to participate fully in the world that way. And the Supreme Court strikes that down in 1883 with the decision called the Civil Rights Cases, which says that that in fact the government has no authority to police individual the behavior of private enterprise.
Right.
So what that, it's sort of kind of where we are in some ways back arguing today. But when that happens, it becomes a huge deal, obviously, for many reasons. But what really shows up in the newspapers is African Americans challenge that. And they buy first-class tickets, and they buy railroad tickets, and they try and make reservations to stay in hotels that are segregated. Mm-hmm. And what fascinated me about that is the newspapers begin to make a very clear distinction between a class distinction between African Americans. They say they're more than happy to share railroad cars with, and sort of the rabble. And this is a period when you start to see that concept of the rabble sort of taking over all African Americans with the argument that it's only the bad guys, the rabble, if you will, who would challenge this decision. They don't have the right decorum. So for me, again, intellectually, the way people think about things, that becomes a real hinge, because that's a major reclassification of the way white Americans were talking about African Americans and whether or not they were acceptable in mainstream society.
Wow, that's incredible. And that concept of the rabble seems like it would have connections to, labor unions and other kinds of ideas of bad crowds in American life, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and really, I think if I have one contribution that I made to the study of Reconstruction, it was the idea that really beginning in 1871, Americans begin to quite deliberately conflate race and class.
Yeah,
and
right.
A lot of my work has been about unpacking how exactly that happened. I find I keep circling back around that and looking at, sort of picking at new ways that happened. Each book has a sort of a different explanation of what was going on that I hope layers that some. It bothers me still that we talk about things being either about race or about class.
Right, yeah.
But the real power of that idea in American society is that thanks to Andrew Johnson and to a number of factors that fell into place in early Reconstruction, in America, those two things can't be untangled. It's race and class. Mm-hmm. And that the untangling of them, I think, makes them able to be leveraged by people who are trying to amass power in order to be used against people of color and lower class people.
That's right. I think that's a good way of putting it. Is that when you disentangle them, and that's when they can be used and leveraged for power. And the kind of conversation we have that's mingling race and class is a little more complicated to have. It must drive you crazy. I mean, you've spent a lot of time thinking about the Republican Party and how much it's transformed and how much that has to do with Reconstruction and the larger history of this country. But it must drive you crazy to hear conservatives or Republicans today talk about that Republicans are the party of Lincoln and they're against slavery, and I don't know why black people would vote for Democrats, etc. Which ignores all these transformations. And I think about the transformation the most because I do 20th century history, so I think about the Southern strategy and Nixon kind of switching the Republican Party in the 20th century. But it sounds like your work describes a transformation of the Republican Party in the 19th century, and I wanted to ask you kind of like how do when you're studying the Republican Party as an anti-slavery party in the beginnings of the Civil War, and they eventually switch to kind of a more business-centered party in the years after, and that has to do with a lot of switching their view of black people and as either human beings or as subjects of class. So I was just wondering how you kind of see the Republican Party transforming during that era to that like business centric party. Was that there at the beginning of the Republican Party? Was that element? Were there signs that this was coming, that it would become such a business friendly party in the years after the Civil War?
No, I don't think it was obvious that that was going to happen, but I think the seeds were there, and here's why. The Republican Party started at a really specific time in American history. It started really in the 1850s, and it started with a specific ideology, and it's a crucially important ideology for Americans, and it's intimately linked to what Americans think about themselves and their nation because of when it rose and because of the fact that the Republicans won the Civil War and protected the U.S. government. And that ideology says this. It argues that the American political economy is essentially a web, that if you help people at the bottom, if you promote equality of opportunity at the bottom, people are going to produce more than they can consume, and they're going that capital, which early Republicans literally called pre-exerted labor, will accumulate, and it will begin to support people at the next level, who will be merchants or who will be larger farmers, who will in turn employ people at the bottom. But their capital will also accumulate, and it will in the end support a few large financiers, industrialists at the top, who of course will hire people at the bottom and give them equality of opportunity. And essentially what you are creating is, as one of my students said, a pyramid scheme.
Right.
But put more nicely, it's more a web, the idea that you cannot help people at the top without helping people at the bottom, and vice versa, that a healthy economy will in fact have this engine driving that will make everything better for everyone. So the Chicago Tribune actually says during the war something to the effect of, until every beggar has a coach in four, we will never get out of business in this world. The problem with that is that web language is very easily manipulated. So that what happened immediately after the war was that people who did not like the Republican system, in that case Democrats, began to argue that the whole way that the Republican system worked was through taxation. It's worth remembering, in fact, it's imperative to remember that the Republicans invented national taxation during the American Civil War. We did not have national taxation before that. So the Democrats begin to argue that this whole concept of promoting equality of opportunity, in the case of the post-Civil War years, equality of opportunity for African Americans, is simply a redistribution of wealth from people who have things to people who don't. And in the 1860s and the early 1870s, that meant from hardworking white people to lazy African Americans.
Wow.
So there is this racist and this xenophobic backlash against this concept of equality of opportunity. And when that happens, the party managed to consolidate power in people at the very top of the economy, who of course gamed the system so they made more and more and more. And then of course we had a financial crash. And that has happened 3 times in American history. Under Lincoln, Teddy Roosevelt, and Eisenhower, the Republican Party has full-throatedly embraced the idea of equality of opportunity, not equality of outcome, but equality of opportunity for people at the bottom, with the idea that that is how you promote a healthy society. So as far as the present goes, one of the things that I like to point out, and I think is crucially important to understand where we are now, is that the GOP, the grand old party, the Republican Party, has been the victim of a hostile takeover. The people who now run the GOP were not Republicans when they started out. Many of them were libertarians, but they called themselves movement conservatives. And that is not the same thing as a Republican. In fact, they went to war against the Republican Party, against the Democrats for sure, but also against the Republicans. And the way this played out was that in the 1920s, the old guard Republicans who ran the Congress and the presidency put in place a system where business ran everything. And they argued that this was the best system ever, and everybody was doing just great and everything was fine, and they owned the successes in the 1920s. So when the whole thing collapsed and it turned out to simply have been a bubble and their system did not work and it turned out they were all corrupt, they didn't have a lot to go on. And so the party in the 1830s had very little choice but to sign on to the concept of the New Deal, FDR's New Deal.
Right.
And this is where you get the Dewey Republicans who like the idea of government intervention in the economy to prevent the excesses of capitalism, but they just don't like it the way the Democrats are doing it. But in taking exception to the Dewey Republican line was a line straight out of Herbert Hoover, and it came by way of Robert Taft, Senator Robert Taft of Ohio, who is William Howard Taft's son, and Taft is a senator.
Yeah.
And he had worked for Hoover, and he believed that the Republicans had it right in the 1920s, that the government must not get involved in the American economy in any way, because if they did, they would put their finger on the scale, and it would kill that concept that everybody naturally was working all for the good of everyone, which kind of made sense if you're coming from rural Ohio, right?
Right.
So the Taft Republicans insisted that, in fact, the government should do nothing at all, to not get involved in the economy at all. And after the war, this plays out in the fight between Eisenhower and Taft in 1952. When Eisenhower gets the nomination, Taft expects to get it. And the Taft supporters are furious at what they think is that their candidate Taft has been sold out by what they call the Eastern establishment.
Interesting.
That's where we get that term.
Yep.
Yeah, that's where we get that term. And they're the ones who put Eisenhower in there. He's actually in there through the machinations of in large part of Henry Cabot Lodge Jr., who's from Massachusetts. So that's where you get the Eastern piece of it. But when the Taft Republicans had been really, really vocal about how Truman was a communist, and you know all that. That's really the rise of McCarthy. He's going to get famous during Eisenhower's speech, but he rises during Truman's. And yet, when Eisenhower gets in office, and instead of being a Taft Republican, instead of getting rid of all the New Deal programs that the Democrats had put in place, when he creates his own sort of New Deal, which he calls the Middle Way, the Taft Republicans go nuts. They go ballistic, and they start to fight back. And this is where you get McCarthy for sure, but this is also where you get the rise of William F. Buckley Jr. In 1951, he had written a book called God, Man at Yale. And in God, Man at Yale, he basically says, listen, we can't trust the concept of the Enlightenment. The subtitle of that book is The Superstition of Academic Freedom. He says, we can't trust this idea of the Enlightenment, that you should put facts in front of people and they'll choose the right stuff, because they keep choosing the New Deal. So they must not be able to choose what's good for them. So we have to stop simply letting them have access to facts and to information. We have to simply tell them that what he calls free enterprise, by which he means the government must not do anything to intervene in the economy, and Christianity are commandments. They're like the 10 Commandments. We can't mess with those. And that anybody who believes that the government should be involved in the economy to create equality of opportunity, which is what the New Deal was doing, is essentially a communist.
Right.
So all of those people, Republicans and Democrats both, are dangerous. And in 1954, he and L. Brent Bazell, who's his brother-in-law, also Catholic, also from Yale, write this book called McCarthy and His Enemies, in which they say, well, McCarthy might have been a little bit rough, but he was right, because America has been taken over by communists. And when people hear that nowadays, they imagine, some little guy in a red hat. But what they meant was anybody who believed in the New Deal or Eisenhower's Middle Way, which is almost all Americans.
Wow. Yeah.
So they said that anybody who believed that was what they called a capital L liberal. This is not the concept of liberal and ideological liberal. This is a movement liberal. And they did that to make it look like they were communists, like capital C communists. They're capital L liberal. Sure. That is everybody except a very small group of people called movement conservatives, capital C conservatives. And those few people, Buckley, Bazell, Taft, Republicans, had a moral obligation to take back the country from the people who espoused the ideology of the New Deal, which is almost everybody.
Right.
And so this is where we get the idea that universities are liberal. That doesn't mean they vote Democratic, which is what people think now. The whole concept from Buckley was that they were people who believed in putting facts and arguments in front of people.
Right.
This is where we get the concept that the news media is liberal. And that's why Fox News can be fair and balanced. Because while the rest of the world, including the Wall Street Journal and Forbes and Bloom, all the people that you believe might be politically on the right might vote for Republicans, those are all liberal because they're trying to make arguments. Fox is fair and balanced because it's not trying to make a fact-based argument. It's trying to give you that worldview that the government has no role in the economy, and its job is to protect us militarily and to promote Christianity.
It's such a disturbing vision you're laying out there of Fox News and being, I hear when you're talking about this stuff, I hear the kind of like, Trump's rebuke of, fake news and all that kind of stuff. It's really about challenging the very idea of facts themselves and challenging the very idea that those things are things that the discourse should be about, when it should be about something like feelings or something more intangible. It's a really frightening idea.
Well, I would push it further and say it is an explicit rejection of the Enlightenment.
Right.
And the Enlightenment is exactly what this country was based on.
Mm-hmm.
So the idea that we don't put facts in front of people and instead we offer them an ideology is an explicit return to the era before humans were given the right to choose what they believed would move society forward. This is a deliberate attempt to go back to traditionalism. And in fact, you do see that. I mean, Steve Bannon used to talk about that on occasion. And when I used to say to people, we're in real trouble here because movement conservatism cannot compromise. People kept trying to make compromises. Old Republicans could compromise. Reagan even talked a good movement conservative line, but he could compromise.
Sure.
Somebody like Tom Cotton and Ted Cruz cannot compromise because it's the minute you make a compromise, you've lost the whole game.
Right.
And what we're seeing now, I think, under President Trump, who I don't think is an ideologue except to the degree that he believes that whatever is good for Donald Trump is what should be law. He is espousing these values, and what we're seeing is a systematic dismantling of the New Deal state, which is precisely what the Taft Republicans, who became the movement conservatives, wanted when they launched what at the time people thought was a crazy effort in the 1950s. And even at the time, Buckley said, we are not conservatives, we're radicals. We want to get rid of all this new stuff and go back to the way things were. And this is precisely, I think, what we're seeing play out nowadays.
So your latest book came out in 2014 called "To Make Men Free: A History of the Republican Party," and is that your first? That's your first book that you talked a lot about the 20th century, right? It was kind of leaping out of the 19th century. Is that the first foray into that?
It was, but it's not quite as big a leap as people might think, because I had the great fortune of beginning my career at a university where there were very few historians. So I had actually I've taught both halves of the U.S. survey, and my signature course was the second half of the U.S. history survey for many years.
Yep.
So a lot of people have said, how can she possibly know this stuff? I'm like, well, you try teaching it for a decade.
Yeah, I've done the same thing. I've taught the second half of the U.S. survey for like 12 years. And it really, I'm sure I'd probably cringe going back to the first year I was teaching it. But it really, it forces you to think, holistically about the century, if that makes sense.
It does, and the connections to the past. What really hurt me it was hardest for me in the 20th century part of that book was I don't know foreign affairs.
Mm-hmm.
I'm really good on America. I know America cold, but man, I remember sitting there trying to figure out where, when Nixon and Kissinger are creating the triangle with China and Russia, and China and Russia were fighting over an island on a border in a river, and I'm thinking, man, where on earth? I remember poring over maps going, there's got to be a river here somewhere.
Yeah, right. That's so funny. That's deep history nerd stuff. Is like finding that river is going to make that connection for you. What I wanted to ask, why I brought that up, that your book in 2014 is that it sounds like you were working that. If that book came out in 2014, you were working on this kind of like history of the Republican Party during the years that Obama was president. So I just kind of wanted to know, kind of the Republican Party, during the Obama years, I think of really revealing themselves in another level of kind of like the racial resentment. You saw the face of the Republican Party come out in very ugly ways during the Obama years. And how much was that kind of weighing on you while you were writing that book?
Well, curiously enough, it's interesting to hear you say that. I didn't pick that up in a funny way because, of course, what I know is Reconstruction in the late 19th century, and that to me is the blueprint for really everything that came after. So many people reacted to the rise of the Tea Party and the viciousness of Mitch McConnell and Paul Ryan and all the different levels that were going on during the Obama years as something new. Whereas to me, I reacted to them as, oh yeah, this is what's going to happen next. And then of course it would fall like clockwork and people would be like, how'd you know that? It's like, this is not rocket science. We have a blueprint. We know how if you pull this string, this thing over here moves. And I think that's one of my frustrations with the present moment is people don't understand that our history doesn't have like a 3-minute shelf life. You actually you can't understand when something happens over here, you can't understand it unless you understand what's happened before. And so, for example, the whole Mueller investigation, I know exactly when news dropped about Russia because I study politics. I've done it for 30 years. I know what I'm seeing. And an awful lot of chaff goes by and you just don't react. I think of it like a trough of cement being poured into a foundation, which I've seen a number of times. And, there's rocks and stuff that goes by. But if a child's toy goes by, you react. It's something different, and God help you if, something that really, a body or something goes by, right? When the when the Russia news went by, I went, oh my God. That's a fish leaping out of the water here. That's something really to watch. And it's really important, and I've been all over it since the beginning because I get this, And it frustrates me the people who will say, oh, it's just nothing important, or oh, there's nothing there, and if you really understand the history and the history of where we are and the history of what Donald Trump is and the history of what the movement conservatives who've taken over the party are now like, it's really kind of not a mystery what's happening. And it frustrates me that the news media seems to be like, oh, God, here's a shiny object. Oh, look, here's another shiny object. And somebody like me can look and say, no, that's a shiny object. But here's the through line, and here's why it matters.
So why does Russia matter? Because it's funny because it's happening. This conversation about Russia is happening like kind of multi-leveled place because there are people that are talking about the facts of the Russia case, in the news media, and then there are people on both sides who are talking about whether the investigation is legitimate at all and whether it's something we should be paying attention to at all. But when you say it's a shiny object, what does that mean to you? Why is Russia such an important part of the kind of Trump puzzle?
I think we are in the biggest crisis that America has ever been in before. And the reason people aren't aware of it is because war was declared not with bombs, but with cyber attacks. And what truly horrifies me is what looks to me like the fact that much, not all, but much of our government has been co-opted. And this makes sense if you look at the way Russia has played its cards since the fall of the USSR. It also makes sense if you look at Reconstruction, which I can tell you more about.
Sure, I'd love to
and
hear
why
that,
that's the case. But there are many moving pieces, and they're international moving pieces. But what I see is an attempt across the world to destroy the concept of liberal democracy and to replace it with oligarchy. And the fact that this is happening and that seems to me to be very clear that many members of our government are implicated in it. And I don't just mean the ones who have already been indicted. And it's worth remembering that we now have 19 indictments, 4 guilty pleas, and we know a number of those people are working with the investigator. And that I could walk you through the appointment of that investigator, which is legal, and he is operating legally. But the fact that this is as big as it is terrifies me because it's way bigger than Watergate, which was big enough, by the way.
Sure.
But that's centered around Nixon, and it's centered around the White House. Once you are including people in Congress as well, and I do believe there are people in Congress that are implicated because that's the only way I can explain their behavior. And you implicate business people, and you implicate other foreign nationals, I think it becomes so large, it's hard for people to get their heads around. And I can see people doing as they're doing now, saying, oh, they're all just corrupt. This is always the way it is. No, it's not. This is new. The idea that our government and members of our government would work with any foreign power to gain access to our government and to change our laws to benefit them, to sell out the American people for the benefit of oligarchs in other countries or for the benefit of other countries' governments, is, to my mind, an attack on our sovereignty. And it's an attack that appears to be working. And the idea that we're kind of going, oh, is it legitimate? And oh, why doesn't Mueller hurry up? And oh, there's nothing there. Instead of all patriots saying, this is the moment when we have to stand together and reject this destruction of our democracy. That terrifies me.
Yeah, and I don't know what all this means for electoral politics too, because where we're heading. I think that it's weird because when I hear all the Russian stuff, a lot of me, and I hear this opinion a lot. This idea that the Russian stuff, the Russian investigation is a distraction from really dealing with why Trump won the election, right? But it seems like we can have both conversations at once, if that makes sense. It sounds like that's kind of what you're proposing.
It's the same conversation, really. And again, it comes back to what I do for a living. I study the way ideas affect the way people think about politics. Mm-hmm. And I believe that we will learn a lot more than we know now, for sure, in many different fields. That is, in the mechanics of the last election. But it seems clear from what we know about Cambridge Analytica and about Facebook and about Twitter that Russian nationals, backed by the Russian government, leveraged American public opinion through advertising, at least on those media, but I would lay money that it's also Drudge, possibly Red State, and Breitbart for sure, where Bannon was employed, to change the way people thought about our country and about ourselves and to change the way they voted. Now, they might have done more as well, but that intellectual and psychological attack on our country is, I think, the future of warfare, first of all.
Sure.
And I suspect we're not the only ones that they hit. But the reason I say it's like Reconstruction is because, and if you'll let me play a little bit here, I don't want to write a book on this, but I think it's an instructive comparison. The oligarchs in the South, the slaveholders in the South, lost the Civil War. They put 600,000 Americans out of commission. They cost the country almost $6 billion, and they lost. So what did they do next? What they did next was they tried to take over the Congress, and they tried to do that in the 1870s. The Democrats get control of the House in 1874. They get control of the Senate in 1878. They're seated in 1879. That's when you have a Democratic Congress. And what they try to do, it's a lost moment in American history, but what they try and do is they try and shut down the government until President Hayes does what they want.
Right.
They say, we're not going to give you any money to do anything until you, people talk about, doing this and that. What they really want is to demonstrate to Hayes that they call the shots. So they want him to take all the troops out of the South. There are U.S. troops in the South at that time. They don't go out in 77. That's an urban myth. They want the troops out of the South, and they want Hayes to do their bidding. And people are appalled. The Republicans, who are a minority in Congress, but the minority leader is James Garfield. That's why he gets famous later. They say, listen, you guys lost on the battlefield. You're not going to win in the Congress. We're not going to let this happen. And the country rallies behind them, and they put down that wing of the Democratic Party, and the Democrats, after that election, have to sort of revamp themselves and accept the outcome of Reconstruction, the Reconstruction amendments.
Right.
But they don't. They don't really. What they manage to do then is they go into public opinion, and they change public opinion. And if you think about it, by the 19-teens, 1920s, they lost the Civil War, and they lost getting control of Congress. But by then, they really have regained racial control of the American South, which is precisely what they wanted in the first place. And that business of losing the war, if you want to move it to the 20th century, losing the Cold War, and then trying to get what you wanted to begin with by changing people's opinions, it seems to me to look very much like what Putin is doing.
Yeah. Well, when I think about the campaign in 2016 and Trump's kind of going around with stadiums filled with people chanting "Build the Wall" and all that kind of thing. That kind of populist racism that he was activating seemed like something that Republicans have been playing with for a long time. And I wonder what your thoughts on, because as someone who studied the Republican Party over its entire history and its entire life and all these different kind of evolutions, there is this big kind of conversation happening right now about like how Trump and Trumpism, how much is it a continuity and how much is it a break with the previous Republican Party? And it seems like you're kind of on the side that Trump is and Trumpism is kind of anomalous, or that you mentioned that there's been like a coup, the Republican Party has been taken over. But how much do you see a continuity too? Because it seems like, when I look at the Republican Party even today, like, how they're pursuing the embassy in Israel, a lot of this stuff has been kind of, there for a very long time.
Well, so this is a hair I split that a lot of people get mad at me about, and that is that, as I say, I don't believe what is currently acting as the GOP espouses real Republican principles in any way. I think the real Republican principles are the principles of Lincoln, Roosevelt, and Eisenhower. These people are movement conservatives, and the way movement conservatives took power, I think, is a fascinating one. They really managed to consolidate to get into the White House, of course, with Nixon and his Southern strategy, and also his attacks on women by 1970, and then with Reagan, who rides that same language, and then finally, it's really Newt Gingrich who manages to go in and slash and burn and take out all the Eisenhower Republicans. But the way that they gain power, I think, is really instructive, because they do it in the late 1960s. And they do it at a time when the Republicans and the Democrats both have turned to political science, with the idea that you garner voters and you garner votes by getting them, by sort of slicing and dicing the electorates, promising left-handed typists in Duluth cleaner ribbons and somebody else a bridge. And so there ceased to be a national narrative in the Republican and the Democratic parties. It was much more about, let's see what coalitions we can build. In the midst of this, the movement conservatives advanced a very clear, almost mythical image. And that was that of the individual being crushed by the behemoth government. And that, of course, is a mythical image. Like I say, it's back in the Bible. It's before that. It's in Gilgamesh. It's everywhere. But it's one that is really easy, because it ties right into a kind of narrative that is very popular for preparing a population for a dictatorship. And, the reason I know about this is this terrified Eisenhower, and Eisenhower read a lot about it, and he was very fond of a book called True Believer by Erich Hoffer, who speculated about the rise of Mussolini and Hitler in the 1950s and how it had happened. And what Hoffer said is that, these, don't worry about the Hitlers and the Mussolinis, because they don't matter. They could be anybody in a way. What matters is those guys are around everywhere, and only sometimes do they rise to power. So you've got to look at the conditions of why they rise to power. And the conditions are these. You get a population that feels like it's disenfranchised, either politically or culturally or religiously or socially, or economically, and you tell them that you find someone for them to blame, that it's not their fault that they're out of step with modernity. It's somebody else's fault. And who you blame is not really important. But what's important is that you convince them that they're suffering at the hands of this other. And you encourage them to resent that other and to attach to that other all sorts of negative characteristics. And that will prepare them in such a way that when you get a leader to rise and to tell them that he can return them to power, he can make them significant again, that they are being unfairly crushed, he will be able to turn them against that other. And as they dehumanize that other by kicking them, being violent against them, killing them, that further dehumanizes them, because the only way you can get away with treating somebody like that is if they're not really human. So what the movement conservatives did is they did that beautifully. They said, listen, you guys are the forgotten Americans, right? There's Nixon for you. The reason you're in the trouble you're in is not because we're in this period, this really unsettled post-World War II Cold War. The reason you're in the position you're in is because this evil government the Eastern establishment, is handing over your tax dollars to African Americans.
Yep.
And Lee Atwater put this really clearly, Nixon's man, Lee Atwater, who said, we can't use the N-word anymore. We have to talk about taxes.
Yeah.
But they said, they blamed African Americans who were trying to leverage the government to get something out of it. They blamed women who wanted abortions, who didn't want to be good homemakers. Now they're blaming immigrants. There's this other that is destroying this good, the soul of America, who doesn't ask for anything and whose tax dollars are being sucked dry by these bad people. And that argument is what Reagan rode to power on. If you remember, 1977, I think it is Star Wars, which is this theme exactly.
Yep. And
Reagan rises to power in California in 78 with this same argument, the little guy being crushed by the behemoth government. And people believed it, but they didn't really believe his idea of trickle-down economics, as he called it. And he does. I can talk you how he manages to sell that. But Americans figured out fairly early on that this system didn't really help them. So as this transpired, the Republican language has gotten more and more and more crazy, until for me the real sign was when Carly Fiorina in the debates in 2016 said that Democrats were literally killing babies so they could sell their body parts.
Yeah. Yep.
And to my mind, I said, that's Hitler speak. That's dehumanizing Democrats to the point that who wouldn't kill somebody who is dismembering babies to sell their body parts?
Yeah.
And because they had to ratchet this language up more and more and more, and at the same time they disfranchised the Democrats and gerrymandered against the Democrats more and more, so they had a more and more extremist population to attract. So Trump, when he came in and said and did the horrific things he did, he was really simply playing that movement conservative narrative out to its logical end.
Yeah.
It's exactly the path we started on in 1951 with God and Man at Yale. So he is an aberration in some ways, but in terms of the language and the people who put him there, I don't blame him for that. I blame the Republicans from Newt Gingrich on.
Yeah, and for creating a landscape that has a landscape of political discourse that, you talk about that dehumanization, that target of the other, whether it's such, what's interesting about it to me is how it shifts so quickly and how they kind of one other that is, hated and seen as the worst thing in the world in one, in one breath is forgotten as another target is kind of foisted upon us. So it's like, you get black people being the scapegoat for people in the 1960s, but then by the time you get to Trump, he's talking about Mexicans as rapists and coming across the border, but also Muslims, but also now he's turned his attention, the alt-right has turned their attention to high school kids that are protesting about gun control. The language, I think you're right, is always the same. It's always about kind of identifying them as like inhuman. And to me, like seeing them do this to high school kids has been really kind of nailed down that idea that it's just getting nastier.
I was reading some of David Hogg's tweets yesterday and the responses to them, and my reaction was the same. It was like, it's almost like George Orwell's 2 Minutes of Hate, right?
Sure.
That we drop everything and we just hate who the other person is. And the thing about that is that, we started out by talking about where I come from. I'm from a town that is purple. My dearest friends are Republicans, some of them. And they're not bad people. Now, I'm not at all embracing the alt-right or any of those things. And they wouldn't do that in person. There is somehow this online this hate group that lives online and that is managing to keep alive ideas that should not have any kind of public airing.
Yeah.
And this is one of the places that I talk, people always ask me, what can I do in this moment? And I say, take up oxygen. Say this is not okay. And I say this to my friends who on the right who hate Trump and are trying to hide under their desks. And I say, that's not good enough.
Yeah.
Call people out. When somebody says that, I don't know, that we're going to have Sharia law in Oklahoma, say they're nuts. Don't just say it privately, say it in public.
Mm-hmm.
Because that's, after 30 years in this business, that is what I believe changes society, is the way people talk about things, the way, politicians they want votes, they're going to swing to where the language is. So if people say, we hate all Muslims and we need to keep them out of the country, and that's the way people are going, that's what politicians will do.
Sure.
But if they say the opposite, that's what politicians will say, and those kind of politicians will rise. I maintain, that if you dropped Donald Trump down in the deepest, darkest parts of a society of Martians, he would instantly scream that he's in favor of Martians. I mean, it is all about
make Mars
being
great
popular
again
with the people around him. Exactly.
Well, that idea, that you've brought up, which is really, I think, an important one about kind of the challenge to even just Enlightenment ideals of human discourse and all that. It seems like I don't know, when I was watching the debates, the 2016 debates, a lot of us, and I was I had this thought for a second, I think I heard it a lot, was that Trump is so rude and is so counterfactual and so wrong about everything that when he finally debates someone like Hillary Clinton, who's actually intelligent and articulate and able to have a reservoir of facts to bring out, that he's going to just be destroyed. He won't be able to defeat that. But it seemed like it actually benefited him to kind of just call her names and stand there and not really engage in the facts. And I just wonder, like, how do you change people's minds with reason and facts when the whole kind of template of their discourse is based on refuting that stuff or not paying any attention to it?
Well, I have trouble revisiting the 2012 election because we have to remember that Hillary Clinton did win that election with the popular vote. And I'm afraid I still think the jury is out on how that vote really happened. Mm-hmm. So I think it's a real problem to look back and say, oh, he won, because the reality is he didn't really win. So, but I would also suggest that this movement conservative language that says that any woman who wants a role in the public sphere is somehow trying to get something for nothing really has told against women being involved in the public sphere since the 1980s.
Sure.
The world in which I grew up had a lot more active, visible women, and since then, part of movement conservatism is the idea that a good household is an individualist man who takes care of his women. And women are not supposed to want to do anything other than stay home and take care of the home or be sort of sex objects. It's almost a cowboy imagery because a lot of it comes from the cowboy imagery. So a lot of people had to work against that, the idea that somehow women, and we know we have tons of studies on this, women who want power are by definition somehow un-American. They're not somebody we want to have be part of our society. So there is that, but the piece that you and I haven't talked about is religion. And the other piece, of course, of the movement conservative language was, and their genius was, when it was clear to Reagan in 1986 that he was not going to be able to protect his tax cuts, he knew he needed new voters. And what they did was they quite deliberately turned to incorporating evangelicals into a new voting bloc. Traditionally, evangelicals had split somewhat evenly unless they didn't vote altogether because they believed that politics would corrupt their religion. So moving evangelicals into the fold and then feeding them a steady diet of Fox News and the idea that anybody who didn't vote Republican wanted to kill babies and wanted to attack the religious basis of humanity was a very powerful way to motivate people to vote in favor of somebody like Trump. And if you look at his support now, it is overwhelmingly his evangelical base. That's why we're in Jerusalem today on this day we're recording. Nobody else wants to be there. It's the evangelicals, and a few Jews like Jared Kushner and Ivanka Trump. But the idea of moving our embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, which was obviously going to throw gasoline on a fire, is an attempt to shore up that base in the face of the Mueller investigation because he knows he needs them on his team. So one of the other statistics from 2016 that I think is interesting, we always talk about how white women voted for Trump, but the crucial adjective that's missing from that is evangelical. White evangelical women voted for Trump. And that insertion of the concept that William F. Buckley Jr. first said, we have to use the government to promote Christianity, has made for, again, an anti-Enlightenment voting base for somebody like Donald Trump that is unshakable, because again, that's the point of what Eric Hoffer said in True Believer. The whole point of being a true believer is that you cannot be swayed by fact. You know, you cannot, if somebody says to you, of course Jesus couldn't walk across the water, the reason you're a good believer is because you believe that he walked across the water. You know, you sort of think, I don't mean to put it in the context of Christianity, but the true believer that I always think of about this is Bellatrix Lestrange in Harry Potter.
Right.
You know, J.K. Rowling knew what she was doing. That's a book about the rise of authoritarianism. And, you know, no matter what Voldemort does to Bellatrix Lestrange, she loves him more.
Right.
Because that's how true belief works.
Yeah.
Because the minute you say, oh, crap, I've been taken for a ride, you lose everything. You don't just lose your political affiliation and your friends, you lose your concept of self. And there's a whole lot of people who don't have that kind of wiggle room.
So that answers your our question in some ways of kind of like, why are all these people voting for Republicans and voting for a party that doesn't, have their quote unquote interests or at least material interests in mind? Because it's not really the people that are voting that way aren't really thinking about it that way. They're thinking about it in a totally different kind of frame of mind, and one that's, whether it's religious or not, it has a kind of religious value to it, if that makes sense.
It does, and I would not, there's this big debate between Republicans and Democrats when they're writing platforms about whether or not people think about voting for their economic well-being.
Sure.
And one of the points that Republicans always make is that somebody's well-being is not necessarily their economic well-being.
Yeah.
And I think to boil down what you just said, I think many of the people who are still, I think people voted for Trump in 2016, first of all, believing he would lose. So a lot of those votes were protest votes. As a friend of mine who voted for him said, listen, we wanted to shake up the system, and we didn't like any of the Republicans. So we thought this would be a way of registering a protest, and maybe, Clinton would listen to us.
Sure, yeah.
And look what we got,
Whoops.
With there's egg on our faces. That's right.
Yeah.
So not everybody who voted for him in 2016 actually believed him. But for the people who are true believers, I think that movement conservative narrative gives them a sense of importance and a sense that they will be returned to importance and a sense that somebody is on their team, even if he paid off a porn star when his wife was pregnant and all that, and
Sure.
they don't believe in those things. It makes them feel like they have an opportunity to regain power that they believe they had lost. They believe somehow it's been taken from them, and it gives them something other than themselves and the passage of time to blame for their relative weakness in modern 21st century America.
That's such a critical point of view. Thank you so much for joining me. Can I ask you what you're working on next?
Yeah, I have a book due in August, and it is called, I shouldn't say what it's called because, of course, that changes at the last minute. But it's a look, I hope it is my big book. It's a look at all of American history from Shakespeare to the present. It's short, believe it or not, and it's an idea-driven book. It says that America sits at the fault line between oligarchy and democracy. And it kind of explores what we've been talking about here, how oligarchs amass power over time and how they come to co-opt the American system and why that worked in the 1850s in the present and only in these two periods, why it has never worked in other periods. So we'll see.
Man.
I hope it actually gets in. It's a great deal of fun. You should have seen me dragging myself through The Tempest earlier this month.
Oh, Lord, you've got some extra research to do for this one. Heather Cox Richardson, I really enjoyed talking with you. I think your work is so vital, and I appreciate you spending time with me today.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much.
All right, that is it for today. I want to thank my guest, Heather Cox Richardson. I had a wonderful time talking with her, and I hope you enjoyed that conversation. That was, for me, put a lot of things in perspective. And again, the Republicans are completely and insanely evil, and we have to find a way to stop them. And I think that, no matter what the historical roots of what's happening might be, This is a monster, and this monster, the face of it is something that is getting scarier and scarier every day. So thank you, Heather Cox Richardson, for helping me unpack some of that stuff, and thank you for listening to the show. I appreciate it. You can find more Nostalgia Trap episodes all over the place. Follow us on Twitter at Nostalgia Trap. Go to the Facebook page. We've got an Instagram page. We're throwing this thing everywhere because we want people to listen to these conversations. So if you find them valuable, go ahead and share them and use your social media powers to let the world know. And if you really like the show, go ahead and support the show. Subscribe at patreon.com/nostalgiatrap. Click on Become a Patron and you'll get bonus episodes and all sorts of other fun stuff. Okay, are we good? Thank you. That sounded very Mark Maron. Are we good? We're good? All right. Thanks very much, everyone. I appreciate it. We'll talk soon. Bye-bye.